Well, thank you all. We're ready for I guess we'll call this the penultimate act of the annual meetings, after the ultimate being the reception afterwards. We're going to have a little panel discussion here about the Bretton Woods Institution, what they're doing, where they ought to be going. To my dismay, I understand that you have not received biographical information on the panelists, but I would consider this a test of you. How well informed are you? Because if you don't know who these people are, then you need to do some studying to get you up to speed about what's happening in the world. So let me just name them. Shriti Vadera, Thierry Déau, Vera Songwe, Minouche Shafik. We are honored to have you all here. It's a pleasure to be able to moderate this panel, and you are all lucky. So, thank you. Away we go. Now, this panel provides an opportunity to hear from a group that is extremely well informed about the work of the Bretton Woods institutions, but they also benefit from some outside perspective on the work of these institutions. So I'm going to start by asking, with regard to the existing operations of these institutions, what do you think that they do best, and what do you think they need to work on most? So, Shriti, let me start with you, if that's a fair question.
Thank you, and just want to say to the audience, none of you need to know me, so it's absolutely fine. I would say that the organizations have, actually been at the forefront and the standard bearers of this incredibly unfashionable word, globalization, that halved global poverty. So they have a lot to be proud of, and we shouldn't say that. We shouldn't be worrying about that. And by the way, some of us might remember having to get through to sessions like this through protesting crowds demanding abolition. So we're doing really well not to have to do that. And if they didn't exist, we would be having this discussion would be about inventing them. And you saw from the energy and of the two leaders something really quite extraordinary that hasn't happened in a long time, that these leaders coinciding. So I think that they're making a lot of difference. My real concern is that it's about the change that we're seeing in the world. Jack Welch, now discredited, said if the pace of change outside your organization is greater than the pace of change in your organization, then the end is near. Now, I don't think their end is near, but if you look at geopolitical issues, conflict, populism, nationalism, protectionism, demographic change, jobs, as Ajay was so eloquent about, climate change, AI, indebtedness, they're not waiting for these institutions. They are going through a lot of change, but we have to ask whether the pace and the scale of ambition of that change is sufficient to that challenge. And for me, that is the big issue. There are 4 or 5 buckets. I know that we'll come on to them. The first is the mandate and the objectives. Actually, I think they've been very agile. They follow world trends very well, sometimes rather too well, and have mission creep, but they do it well. The second is governance. It's very arcane. Some of it is in 1944. And I don't mean the whole debate about representation versus control. I think that's a very old-fashioned way of looking at governance. Governance is about accountability. Can you hold their performance and their outcomes to account? Not sure. That is quite where it's at today. We then have the ways they operate, their toolkit, their efficiency, their sort of effectiveness. They have control over that a lot more than the shareholders would suggest, and then of course resources. And I come to that last because I think that their balance sheet could be used more efficiently. You can't just 1% change in the equity loan ratio that the World Bank announced this week, and they've released 30 billion. There is a lot more that can be done, frankly, with their resources. So I would say that it's a mixed bag.
Great, thanks. Minouche, you want to?
Yes.
Would you feel free to add to that question?
So very much a little bit in the same vein. I mean, I think what these institutions do really remarkably is there is this magic of leverage. The genius of the World Bank is that you put in capital and you're able to leverage it, and you pool the resources of 200-ish countries, and not all of them are AAA, but somehow the product that comes out is AAA. Isn't that magic? And against that, you're able to leverage these huge amounts of resources for development. I mean, similarly with the fund, which isn't a leveraged institution, but is able to use the fact that they're pooling risks across an array of countries to come out and provide vast financial resources at very low cost to countries in crisis. So I think that leverage and risk sharing is an incredibly powerful force that these institutions bring to the table of development and financial and international monetary stability. The other thing that I just wanted to say, particularly in a world in which there's polarization and nationalization and people being very parochial and wars and killing each other and et cetera, is these institutions, and particularly for those of us who worked in them, are a microcosm of a better world where people from different nationalities, religions, and backgrounds work together side by side every single day. And there is magic in that. And there is the possibility of people traveling together whose countries may be at war in the outside world, but in this institution they are colleagues and they work together and they overcome their differences. And there's just something very, very special about that at this particular moment in history. What they're less good at, their lesser strengths, as you say, when we have someone's human resources discussion. Here are your strengths and here are your lesser strengths. Their lesser strengths are, they're only as good as their shareholders. When their shareholders are very divided, they get stuck. And there are many issues at the moment where, whether it's governance reform, whether it's debt restructuring, and these are big, big issues, where the institutions are unable to make progress because their shareholders are divided. And I think that is a particular challenge now, but one likely to persist in an era where geopolitics is just very, very fractious.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Now, let me narrow this a little bit. With the pandemic and its aftermath have been particularly hard on developing and some emerging economies. Those have traditionally been the focus of the bank and to a large degree the fund as well. How well have these institutions done in responding to this situation in support of these countries, and what more do they need to be done? Vera, let me start with you.
Well, thank you. I think maybe to pick up on what Kristalina said, clearly during the crisis we saw the IMF and the World Bank respond really quickly, both with the PRGT and the bank on IDA. And I think some of the largest disbursements came from there. But compared to what the countries needed, it was not enough. I must say that what the IMF was able to do in the beginning was they were probably the ones who provided the first sort of debt forgiveness. So the 17 lowest, poorest countries. And that was very helpful. And I think immediately after that, at the time I was at the Economic Commission for Africa, we started calling for a little bit of a debt suspension conversation, the Ministers of Finance. And I want to say that we lost the Minister of Finance, the former Minister of Finance and Governor of the Central Bank of South Africa. I'll take this moment to just think about Tito Mboweni, that I think was an incredible partner in shaping sort of South Africa post-1994, working, of course, with Trevor Manuel, that many people in this side know very well. But we had a meeting with Tito and he was then Minister of Finance of South Africa and the Minister of Finance of Ghana, where the African finance ministers called for a suspension of debt payments. And immediately, I think the letter was sent to the World Bank and the IMF, and the next morning, the IMF came out and said, yes, we're going to do this. And so after the G20 picked it up, and we got the DSSI, Debt Service Suspension Initiative, $13.9 billion to the low-income countries was sort of written away, working through also the credit rating agencies. So I think the sort of speed of the response in terms of paying for the COVID vaccines as well, we worked very closely on what we call the African Vaccine Acquisition Initiative with Strive Masiwiya and a few others in the private sector, Afri-Exim Bank and the ECA, to see whether we could procure vaccines when it was very difficult to get vaccines. And we were able to leverage African countries' SDRs and to come up with $2.2 billion. So this was African money to do it, but we needed some guarantees and to close the gap. And we went to the World Bank, and the World Bank immediately said yes. So we were able to work with the World Bank and some of these countries to procure the first Johnson & Johnson vaccines that came. So there was, I think, a speed in the reaction. On the other side, I think that what we could do more was, and Kristalina started talking about it now, and we're very happy that it's happening, is at that time there was also sort of the conversation of the debt crisis and the debt distress, and everybody was in debt crisis. And I always say that every time that somebody from this building said debt crisis, the spreads on the African markets just went high, and they continued to go higher. And so Africa had debt service payments of $199 billion, and of course, it became quite difficult. And what we kept saying was there are a series of countries that got into the crisis growing at 4, 5, 6%. So they had some good, robust, and some of them 8%. They had good macro fundamentals, but their debt service ratios as a share of their tax collection were higher than 15%. This is a liquidity crisis. This is not yet solvency. This is not yet debt. And we kept insisting at the time, we must label these countries differently so that we can then give the right medicine to the right sickness. And I think I'm very happy today. I heard, Kristalina really now pushing this concept of, the liquidity problem, because we have today about 25 countries, low and middle income countries, in this liquidity trap where debt service ratios, because they had moved to private sector debt, and so this was sort of inflation, interest rate adjusted debt, floating interest rates. With the rise in interest rates in the United States, they woke up one morning, sub-Saharan Africa, $65 billion in debt. And essentially, we've all heard about, debt services are higher than the expenditure in health and education and infrastructure. And I think what we are trying to do with this liquidity gap, which is a new initiative, is to say they're not yet in a debt crisis. If we give them the liquidity that they need, the markets can reopen for them cheaper, but they must have a good growth story or a good growth trajectory. We can get the bilaterals to sort of restructure some of their debt, and the IFIs can come in, and that's why IDA is so important, and the PRGT and the RSTI is so important. We can come in with long-term, I think congratulations to the IMF, congratulations to the World Bank, 30-year loans from the IMF, 50-year loans we just heard now from the World Bank. I think this is what countries are looking for. If this new growth story is climate, it's going to take a long time for us to transition out of it. We need cheaper, longer resources, and I think moving to that is what we're now expecting to happen.
Mm-hmm. Thierry, is there anything you'd like to add from that perspective?
Yes, perhaps less from the emergency response to the crisis, but the aftermath with the interest rate rising and spread rising, and the fact that they were facing quite a lot of debt, and the response that was given to a number of countries. I think the thing that was done very well was the World Bank and IMF working together. Yeah. And not thinking just how do you recover fiscal space, but also thinking about long-term investment in the economy to support growth, to have some impact. Because before it used to be the IMF comes and you open your vein and you wait to die, and then you may recover later. Now it's everything coming together. I take the example of Ethiopia, debt restructuring. They had to let go of the currency control, but at the same time, $1 billion or so from the World Bank to restructure their energy sector that was in dire need and has such an impact on the whole 100 million country. And so thinking both of these sides together, I think that is something that is fairly new and very, very, very powerful and very useful. And as an institution that partner with them as a private investor, we've also seen that they understood that they were not alone. So, words like mobilization of private sector, risk mitigation to scale up private sector investment in this whole equation, it's becoming more normal, and it's really helpful because they actually, in these restructuring things, consult with private sector in terms of what projects could be more impactful, what should we not kill. We know not everything is affordable, so we having more comprehensive discussions about the future of those economies versus sort of giving you the big vaccine first and then wait for you to die and then you recover later. And so I think it's a lot better, and with the involvement of private sector. I mean, what I always regret is speed. AJ said it. Speed, speed, speed. Can we have more speed and more scale? And that's...
Yeah, but you're saying that this, from a private sector point of view, the trend has been positive.
Yeah, I mean, if I compare with 10 years ago, I wouldn't be saying the same thing, for sure. I would be totally desperate and saying, God, what do we do with these institutions? So really, there's been a fundamental change in the approach.
Oh, interesting. Now, Shriti, you are the co-chair of the World Bank's Investor Lab that we heard just heard the Ajay Banga talked about.
Yeah.
How's progress? How's this all going to work? What do you think is feasible, and what do you think is practical?
So I do think I would agree with Thierry that there has been a change, and I would like to say that Ajay and his management team have been drivers of that change, and they should be commended for that. And that's fantastic. We started with the low-hanging fruit guarantees, and he talked about that. That's troubled. Simplification is the key, because it is really otherwise impossible for the private sector to navigate the World Bank. It is just this humongous beast and bureaucracy, and you can't get yourself through it. So they are working on simplification, but 16 months to project approval is a long time, and a lot of money for the private sector just to be waiting for a decision. So it's important that we know ex ante what is going to be available, what is the chances of it being approved. So they're working on that, and that's interesting. The FX thing, I know that Ajay is finding that difficult and struggling with it, but what I feel has been a change in the World Bank is that they are taking domestic financial institutions seriously, much more seriously than they used to, and that is really important. And of course, yes, it takes a long time to create domestic capital markets, but if you don't start today, they're definitely not going to happen. So that has worked really well. The other change that they're thinking about, which is a mindset shift as well, it's a debt institution, but we're asking them to look at equity in essence, first loss or whatever, junior capital. And that is problematic for them. And for one reason, they measure themselves by how much they lend, not how much they mobilize from the private sector. So if you change that mindset, even though equity is more expensive, it could mobilize more private sector resources. So again, it needs to be about what are you measuring? What is your outcome? What is the performance about? For me, the single most important thing, it is my equivalent of the Holy Grail, is around creating an asset class, which you heard Ajay talk about today. And that is because, simply put, there is enormous amounts of wishful thinking about the level of private resource that can be mobilized for climate change and other global public goods. These institutions have a responsibility to their depositors and their pensioners and everybody else. They can't just put their money in. This mobilization is not going to happen unless it is in a tradable, liquid instrument. And we are talking about now not the banks that regularly work with the World Bank. We're talking about the big institutional investors that have the deepest pools of capital who simply do not play with the World Bank, not in this space at all. And what they need is a tradable, rated, easy instrument that we need to find ways of creating. That is all about scale. It can't be tailored and bespoke. I've never seen so much tailoring and bespoking in really. It can't be tailored and bespoke. It has to be standardized and replicable. And it can't just be the bank, because this is a very large market. And so we need to work with other multilaterals, with domestic financial institutions, with private institutions, to try and create this asset class. Because if we want this climate finance hole to be financed, this is the billions to trillions only comes from this source.
Well, Vera, you've done a lot of work on thinking about how these institutions can deal with, among other things, with global public goods, but especially with climate change. How practical is it that these Bretton Woods institutions that have been used to working on a bilateral country-by-country basis can effectively help shape work on climate change that fits into what Shriti just described?
No, I think, let me maybe give an example of what is happening in India today. India is now part of the Emerging Market Bond Index. And so essentially, when we talk about capital, we have sort of active capital and sort of non-active sort of capital. And because India has just gotten into the EMBI, India is getting $100 billion of investment just flow, because it's a standardized asset class. You know, it is okay. The governor of the central bank now has to worry about appreciation of the Indian rupee, but this is what standardization does, because of the capital we talk about that exists, a lot of this dormant sort of non-active capital is waiting for somebody to package something nicely and so that they can just buy it. I say this because the liquidity and sustainability facility that I'm working with, we have just created a new Africa index. And the idea is that hopefully in the next 4 or 5 years, we can standardize an asset class also for Africa. So this is possible and it's doable. And the facility is called the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility because of the sustainability part. But the sustainability part is difficult today for many reasons, particularly because the sustainability part itself needs standardization. And so there's a lot of work now on sort of the interoperability, the measurement, the verification, the registration of a carbon asset. What is it? What does it look like? And how can we procure it? I think we talk a lot. The IMF has done studies that say that sort of the average accepted carbon price should be somewhere in the order of $80 to $120 dollars. Today we're getting $5. The sort of carbon market was seen as another way, including Kristalina talked about the special drawing rights of the SDRs, of providing domestic resource mobilization to many of these economies, particularly many of the emerging markets, the Amazon, of course. If you want the Amazon and the peatforests of Africa are the two sort of lungs of the world. And so they are sequestering carbon. If we were to put a price to that, you know, the kinds of money that we need to power Africa and to power Latin America and to send girls to school, we can get from the carbon markets. But we are not able to do that because we haven't standardized and we haven't created integrity enough in that space. And I think that the work that the RST is doing, the work that the World Bank is doing now with the CCDRs, and getting countries to begin to sort of bring together platforms of all of government approaches to climate change, I think is going to be very, very important. We need the advanced economies to agree as when they go to the G20 on interoperable taxonomies. And finally, the last thing I see, Kristalina said 1,000 or 7,000, I can't remember, the number was so large, trade distorting practices that are happening from the advanced economies. One of them is the Common Border Adjustment Policy, another one is the IRA. All of this behind them are supposed to then deliver technology which will help us with climate. If we do the CBAM and if we do the IRA, then we must in some sense find ways of sharing the technology so that, you know, we can have even faster trade flows and create those jobs that Ajay was talking about.
Minouche, go ahead.
Well, I'm just going to add a little note of skepticism on this search for standardization, because I used to be the Vice President for Infrastructure at the World Bank and the IFC. So project finance is bespoke. because each project looks a little bit different than the last project. And if you think about the markets where we've achieved lots of standardization and securitization and scale, whether it's the treasury market, the best example of all, versus, or the 30-year fixed mortgage rate market in the United States, those are pretty bog standard pretty bog standard instruments. A power plant in India versus a power plant in Mozambique are going to look really different, and the risks around those are going to look very different. And so I appreciate the idea of standardization being an important tool, but the reality on the ground, I think it makes it very difficult. And so the question is, what alternatives can these institutions provide? And I think a potentially more promising route is project certification by these institutions. If investors know that the World Bank or the IFC or the African Development Bank have been all over this project and have assessed it to be of a certain quality, and that then can get turned into a standardized pool of a set of projects that the World Bank and the IFC have certified as being, let's call it, a certain credit rating. I think that might be a more realistic way to achieve what you're trying to achieve, which is scale and financing.
I would like to pick up on that. I think the kite marking, so to speak,
right,
which we talk about a lot at the lab, is really critical. It's extremely hard because you're asking people to kite mark not just the project's feasibility, but in this world where we have a lot of campaigners who would just prefer us to divest rather than to invest, you're asking them to also kite mark whether something is genuinely green. And that is very politically fraught. And Mark Carney and I have been working on this for a while, and we have yet to find an institution prepared to do it. Just so we're clear.
There are a few initiatives.
But they should step up.
They should step up. And the other thing I want to say about securitization, because I don't want to get into the technical details on standardization, it is possible because we're always talking about post-completion, and we're talking about having a wrapper with the IMF, the World Bank. So it's all doable. When sort of we were the financial engineering of it, it's doable. I think I'm finding the biggest problem is making the institutions all work together. That is much more problematic indeed than the actual sort of projects themselves.
Hold that thought, because we're going to come back to that issue. Thierry, go ahead.
Just on this, standardization in a way is a thought and an ideal. The UK government was very smart when they hit that wall of you can't standardize project finance. They went to normalization, but it was the same.
It's the same.
So it's just that the word.
But you had an entity that normalized.
Yeah, but it is possible, and in fact, to a great extent, a number of African countries use the same type of contract that have been pretty much drafted by the same DFIs and the same IFIs, and it's possible to ask them to also harmonize their regulation when it comes to energy, when it comes to water. And that's the level of normalization, standardization, or rapprochement that you need to really put something later on. From the sustainability perspective, actually, I happen to chair an initiative called Fast
Are you going
Infra,
to do the kite mark then?
which involves IFC, HSBC, a number of institutions, the OECD, and all. To really try to have a rating for sustainability. And the whole goal is to scale up. They've been working on it for about 2-3 years already. We're in test period, and Bloomberg is quite involved in terms of data management in there. So I think we'll get there. So it's not impossible, and we'll get there fast.
But the issue is scale. The banks that we're talking about, the banks that do project finance, they don't have the scale. The trillions are in the capital markets. That's the bit we have to tap.
We agree the banks never had any money anyway.
And they never had any money.
The real money is with the asset owners.
Correct.
And they are going through the capital market or sometimes through the banks. But I totally agree. It's scale, and so we need those sort of ratings. But I don't think that standardization is impossible as long as we don't use that word.
I think the word that
It scares a lot of
Yeah.
institutions
It's really
here.
bringing regulations, contracts to better standards. And I don't think we're far away from that.
Indeed. I'm going to have a momentary advertisement for the work of the Bretton Woods Multilateral Reform Working Group,
Right.
whose report I hope you all will read, that said we have on climate an issue that everyone agrees now is important, is pressing, potentially existential, yet not that much has happened. What needs to be done? We've identified 3 gaps in both the public and the private. A gap in governance, no one's in charge. A gap of implementation, which we've just been talking about here a bit, namely, what instruments would you use if you were going to operate at scale? And third, a gap in accountability.
Yeah.
If you've invested in this instrument for this end, this positive goal, how do you know that it's accomplishing it? Who is going to assure the investor that that's, or the public investor or private, that that's what's happening? Is that a reasonable way to look at things? And how do we move forward on this? Can the Bretton Woods institutions themselves take important leaps forward, or does this require a political agreement first?
I think they could be supporting governments, because at the end of the day, today, climate issues are based on government NDCs. Unfortunately, they're not regional. They are every single government, every single country are their own target in relation to climate, and then they need to execute and deploy along those targets. And that has sectorial consequences in their country that are very different from other countries. So hoping to have a sort of global, so how do we execute climate investment, I think it's a dream. And so those governments need, the governance is important, need to take responsibility. But where the institutions can help is actually sit down with those governments and really have a deployment and an execution plan. Because let's be honest, everybody goes to the COP, and half of the countries that are coming with NDCs, they have actually no idea what that is for in terms of consequences for investment, for regulation, so they all have a plan, but not a feasible plan or not a plan that can be executed. So it's really going into action, because those plans are there, by the way, where the institutions can actually be helpful with their knowledge, with their financial strength, their ability to do project preparation, their ability to bring people and do policy engagement. I'm being very pragmatic about these things.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Minouche, go ahead.
I mean, we've made a mess of the climate architecture. There are something like 80 institutions out there that provide climate finance, multilateral and bilateral, that we have created over the last decade to deal with climate finance. And it's a complete mess in terms of the international architecture. And part of that, to be frank, and I guess I could say this, is because under the previous regime, the World Bank didn't step up and provide leadership, because there was some skepticism around climate issues under the previous regime. And the obvious leadership should have come from the World Bank, because it has the scale and the balance sheet that could begin to mobilize the system to do a better job. So we are where we are. I think a mix of what Thierry was saying, which was the pragmatic approach at the national level, but I do think we probably need to start thinking about some slightly more radical solutions. And I think you're right, John, that governance is part of the problem. And for a problem like climate change, maybe we need a different kind of governance structure, not based, like the shareholding of the Bretton Woods institutions, on the size of your economy, but on your role in the climate system and your contributions to the problem and your impact and the degree to which you're affected. And just to drop another idea, maybe we need a global revenue stream. Maybe we need a global tax. And As an economist, I
Definitely
have to
agree with
say
that.
the most efficient solution would be a carbon tax, but as close as we can get to a carbon tax would be the best way.
So you know Minouche is an economist.
We all would like a carbon tax.
Yes.
While waiting for a carbon tax, we could do a new issuance of special drawing rights that are climate SDRs that are allocated based on sort of incidence and effectiveness. We just heard Kristalina talk about how important and how useful and how far the SDRs went. And if there is one crisis we know is going to happen, is the climate crisis. If there is one crisis we know how to fix, is the climate crisis. The problem is we're waiting, and we know that every day that we wait is an exponential cost. And we do have within the IMF structures the permission to issue SDRs for crises. It doesn't say whether it's forthcoming or past. We've done it recently, we can do it again, and I really believe that maybe there is something that we could do around sort of pushing. And then, we've just put out a paper, publicity at the CGD saying, maybe what we do then is if we issue SDRs, we give some, distribution to all the multilateral development banks. And we've seen the Inter-American Development Bank and the African Development Bank put out a paper saying they could leverage 1 to 10. All of them can do that, the Caribbean Development Bank, but maybe there is a way where there is an RST in the IMF and something at the World Bank and some of the regional development banks. The local currency issue, one can then fix much faster because a lot of the project development, a lot of sort of that first initial cost of developing any kind of project, that's the most expensive part, where the risk is is highest. If local development banks can do that, national agencies can do that, maybe we don't fight the foreign currency, foreign exchange problem. We just do it locally on local currency, and it's much easier. And SDRs can be a solution to that.
So what I hear is that there are lots of ideas of potential solutions, but we also heard that perhaps the UN-led COP may not be the most effective way forward. Shriti, you had a critical role in organizing the London G20 summit in April 2009. Then we think back, was probably the most impactful, was the peak of the effectiveness of the G20 that adopted a whole set of real measures. Today, the G20 looks like it's stymied. Is the G20 a possible way forward? Or, hint, should the Bretton Woods institutions seize the day?
Well, I think I'll take the hint, but of course, I mean, the point is there are members of the G20 who are sort of at war. I mean, this is not a functioning forum anymore, and we need to find something else. We've got, I don't know how many hundreds descending into Washington for these annual meetings. This is still the place that people come to have conversations where there is still the potential for common ground. So I do think that these organizations can step into this role. And I just want to make, what was the advantage of the G20 in 2009? You've taken me back a long way to a rather traumatic time. But the first was that the leaders recognized that they were looking at, staring into the abyss. They really knew that, and fear does concentrate the mind. And what we have is somehow this sort of slow boiling frog. And maybe that's making it harder to see, although it's not for want of people telling them, and nobody was saying that before the financial crisis. So I think that is important. Secondly, there was one important point of consensus in 2009, which was the recognition around the centrality of trade for prosperity. And we don't have some equivalent consensus here today, and nobody's mentioned so far the Damocles sword, hanging over us in 2 weeks' time. We won't go there. But the third thing that I do want to come to on the Bretton Woods Institution is about political leadership. I've never seen in a G anything before that or since leaders talking to each other without pre-prepared scripts and country positions. And that That is astonishing. I have to admit that Gordon Brown, who was chairing that, did lock the room and then demanded his 150 billion to get to his trillion emergency facility. I mean, a trillion was a lot of money at that time. And he just basically said, you're not leaving until I get this funded, and that's it. And the Sherpas were outside drafting something somewhat less ambitious, and the press was baying, and, you know, he locked the room, and there it was. And you do need to have... And what was interesting about that $1 trillion emergency facility, which the IMF described as breaking the fall of the global in the global economy, was it was never used because it was a confidence trick, and that teaches us a few things. But it is about political leadership, about leaders who can bestride the intersections of politics and economics and markets and international negotiations and push the boundaries out. And if you look for these leaders, and they're not leading countries, they're not heading countries anymore, then you have to look at Bretton Woods institutions, and if they turn around and sort of say, well, you know, we're not leaders of countries, but they have to ask, if not us, who? Mm-hmm. And that's what I would ask them to do.
Yeah, and I would say, back to that period, the reformatting of the IMFC to create a fora that does exactly what you said. The key leaders sitting around a room, no prepared scripts, confidential, have an open discussion. Actually, I've seen change minds, but perhaps there's a possibility here. But
I want to just add one thing that Minouche made a very important point at the start, which was around you're only as good as your shareholders. And I do get that. And I did work for a shareholder for 10 years. So I get it. And I'm not wanting to be naive about it. But when there is a vacuum created by warring shareholders, no consensus, that is a vacuum that there is an opportunity for management to fill.
yes.
Yeah.
And they can have views that prevail. And not all reforms historically have been written by shareholders. They've all been designed by the institutions themselves. And that is something that's worth remembering.
Yes, and I remember all the way back to the Latin debt crisis and the role of Jacques de la Rosière to do exactly what you described.
Yeah, very true.
Minouche, you have lots of experience in both of the Bretton Woods institutions, and from your role in DFID, you have a nice overview. From the very first G20 summit in November 2008, the communique said the MDBs should learn to work together. I think every communique, where there's communique, now there's not clear there will be a communique, but the MDBs are supposed to work together. Right. Is this the impossible dream? We heard some nice words about it earlier, but do you think it's going to happen? And if so, why or why not?
Yeah, I mean, as long as these institutions have existed, as you said, John, this has been a perennial call. And you know, the joke is, and between the bank and the fund, it's often been said that 19th Street is the widest street in Washington. I think, you know, I think, you know, there have been moments when we've seen leadership, say, of the World Bank, of bringing all the MDB leaders together, and I think Ajay today gave several very concrete examples of where he was trying to do that. I think the most promising area is not lots of coordination meetings where we share information and share reports and speak nicely about each other. I think the really important stuff is the stuff around single country strategies, around platforms for co-investment, common ESG standards and safeguard rules, getting our machinery aligned, and from that, cooperation will flow. But at the moment, when you've got completely different rules and systems in each organization, every time anyone tries to work together, they get caught up in the wiring. And of course, the power to enforce that is with the shareholders, because they all own the same institutions. And so it seems to me that a serious push by shareholders on alignment of the plumbing and the rules and the internal regulations would go a long way to fostering cooperation.
Mm-hmm. I just want to maybe interject a little bit on the alignment and the. I've been in many field missions, and sometimes, while I agree that working together is important, sometimes countries need sounding boards. And if we have the same documentation sometimes, then the country almost feels trapped, right? And so it's good to get an opinion from the World Bank, and it's good to get an opinion from the IMF, and it's good to get an opinion from the African Development Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank. And I worry sometimes that maybe some of these, all of us just ganging up on the same country, and sometimes the countries feel that way. And so I think as we do, and I was part of the NK Singh, Larry Summers, MDBs need to work together. So I fully believe in that. The guarantee platform is an amazing thing. It's so much faster. But I think it will be important maybe 1 year later to get some feedback from countries just about, particularly on the knowledge part. Is, there is always a tendency that, you all sort of, we love the GPI today, and everybody then wants to, and a country says, no, that's not what I want to do. And I think we've seen that a little bit with exchange rate controls and some of those things where some countries said, even though you all want to do it from Washington, we're going to do something different. And 10, 15 years later, we have said you were right. And so I think there has to be a little bit of room for countries, even if we come together, to have other opinions, and maybe creating something for that would be important.
Always tension. Thierry, you wanted to say.
I think it depends on the urgency of the matter.
Yes.
Because sometimes too many choices and opinions are not very good. But
no, I fully agree
I
with
wanted
standardization
to say, I mean, first of all, the two institutions that we're talking about, where I think it's really about management on real goals that will make them work together. I have no hope on the shareholders. Let's be serious. Because they sometimes, even though they may not be quarreling amongst each other, they're also schizophrenic on one side, on the other. So I would think that the institutions can find, one of the reasons perhaps that they work well together on certain issues today is the managing director has actually been in the other institutions before. So that is helpful. So knows the culture, so sometimes it takes human collaboration to actually have institutions to collaborate, and that's important, I think, to continue. But if we broaden this to the rest of the system with the DFIs, and there are also some positive things. I mean, when you think about Africa today, IFC shares due diligence and ESG with all the European DFIs. One of them take the lead, and they don't waste anybody's time. So, and this has been going on for quite a few years. It's been quite efficient. No doing due diligence for every single one. So some things are working, and it may not be enough. Again, speed and scale are my two things. But there are some collaborations that exist today. Maybe the African Development Bank will get into that mode as well.
They already are, I think, getting it. They are getting it.
They're getting there. Just take speed and scale. But the boat is moving in the right direction. So I don't want to shoot them too much about collaboration, because there's already quite a lot going, and it's recent. We're talking 5-10 years, but it's been quite impactful.
No, I think we want to separate collaboration on implementation and collaboration on ideas. I think the knowledge part, we must agree that there has to be a room to entertain competition of knowledge. I think competition on implementation, I have no query, and that's why I talked about the guarantees and stuff. But I think on the knowledge, I think given a little bit what is happening, there must be room for diverse and debate to happen. Yeah. And we see that with the...
That's really important also for them to go outside and look at the peer group, or a peer review of everything. It doesn't just have to come from Washington.
Exactly.
And they are very closed in how they are, talk about their ideas externally.
Yeah. And the proof is with the industrial strategies, right? It's one clear one that's happening in front of our eyes now.
Before we come to an end, I want to ask one, for an American audience, inside baseball. Let's call it nuts and bolts question about the organization of the Bretton Woods institutions. And that is, we have take the fund, you have the Board of Governors, now 191 members, pretty big. you have the IMFC advisory, and you have the executive board meeting every day at the level that it does. The Articles of Agreement contemplate the creation of a ministerial council that would create a decision-making body at a ministerial level that would be representative of the entire membership, but with a voting rule that so it could reach decisions on controversial issues, and those decisions would be binding. A similar organization could be created in the bank. Is something like that necessary to really get politically enforceable decisions on these kind of issues? Does anybody want to take that? Mm-hmm. You don't have to.
No, I was going to say,
Yeah,
I mean,
okay.
we all support that but that would be a sign of multilateralism being really hot. And so I don't see it happening. I think we need to keep pushing for it. It would solve quite a lot of issues, which is anywhere where you have pretty much, you need everybody to say yeah to do something is a disaster. I mean, we live this in the European Union. You live this in these institutions, and the moment that you can come to representative decision bodies that can basically decide on a majority or supermajority basis, the entire world could change. But you need to really build the trust of in multilateralism to do that.
If we could impose that solution, it's because we wouldn't need it. Right? I mean, to have the ability to impose that would mean that the problem.
Well,
She's less diplomatic than I am.
No, well, I would.
I think what we
sorry, go
want
ahead.
is in some sense maybe ministers of finance to be closer to the executive directors, so that the sort of transition messages end up being the same, and what we see sometimes is a little bit of a distance between sometimes what the executive boards are saying, and in some sense you impose that solution by locking everybody. Gordon Brown did it by locking everybody in the room and saying, just you the leaders, we need you to talk. And I think that's what the ministers, I think the proposal from the Bretton Woods Committee is the ministers are closer to these problems, and they go on the ground and they see some of these things, and maybe they have
But wouldn't it be
sometimes slightly
simpler to
different,
get the executive directors to work better and more effectively, and it doesn't need an articles change? And there is so much self-reform that is possible without touching the 85% and the 70% and the supermajorities and everything that's needed around governance. It strikes me as extremely strange that the executive directors approve all of the loans individually at quite a small sum, but don't approve the strategy, which strikes me as bizarre. They can't possibly hold the management to account on performance and impact, because the performance and impact is in the loans that they've approved themselves. So the whole thing is actually quite warped. So for me, adding a layer without looking at the structural thing, if you were in a position to add that layer of, break the deadlock, then you should break it in a lot of ways that actually create a more permanent structural reform, rather than having the emergency fly-in of ministers having to agree and have, them locked up in a room. Then you're negotiating whether you want to go to the loo. I mean, literally, it's not a pleasant thing.
I think I'll propose you as the next candidate. Next round.
Minouche.
I mean, I just would posit a slightly different view, which is in a moment of deep geopolitical tensions, where finance ministers are likely to be very political animals at the moment.
Yeah.
The reality is that the resident board members tend to be sympathetic to the institution, and there is quite a lot of peer pressure around that table to agree. And I suspect a lot of the argument is executive board members going back to capitals and saying, no, be a bit more moderate. We need an agreement. My colleagues around the table are not going to like it if we take such a hard line. So in easy times, the ministerial council might be a good idea, but in really difficult political times, we actually might be better off with this rather cumbersome, inefficient governance structure and focus
But it
more
allows-
on the kind of
And it allows sometimes the management's view to prevail because
Quite.
they can.
I
I mean, my advice to management is
63
ask for less permission.
Yeah.
I mean, just do it.
I mean, let's face John and I, we both chaired, I chaired 167 board meetings at the IMF. You probably chaired more than me. And of course, one of the most common tactics was they all disagreed with each other.
Yeah, so you
just
agree.
went through the middle.
Exactly.
Right? Because they're not agreeing. And so it's a consensus based, and management
Vacuum and
proposes
you
the
take it. Yeah.
solution.
Well, I'm afraid we've come to an end. But we still have the conundrum. We agree that the most pressing issues are global issues, and especially climate, that something needs to be done, and yet the action so far has fallen so far short of what we think needs to be done. So I think this has been an extremely...
Cheerful.
Good sub-
Well, Shriti, you said it. When folks become convinced that action is necessary, then it will happen. And it strikes me we're getting closer.
Going to take?
I think we're getting
And we
closer.
should be, can we end with being grateful about the coincidence of really determined, open-minded leaders at the moment? It's a happy accident. We'd like it not to be a happy accident the next time, but
And
it
indeed.
is. So we should be grateful for that.
Indeed. And frankly, leadership of folks like you who, from the private sector, from the public sector, are focused on trying to see what we can do to move this forward and get this done. So with that, thanks.